Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of our anime Bible studies in Shady Oak Ministries. I'm of course Shady Oak, and today we're going to be discussing the anime Snow White with the Red Hair. And yes, this does have direct parallels and implications to the Brothers Grimm story of Snow White, and if you are interested in seeing the biblical parallels within that story and its ties back to the Bible and its originality, and as well how the plot of Snow White couldn't quite get away from that, and the story still applies, I encourage you to go into our Disney Bible study section and listen to the one on Snow White, because it emphasizes these direct points. But instead of emphasizing how Snow White was representation of Israel, and the seven dwarves were representative of the law, and the wicked queen was obviously representation of Satan himself and his attempts to thwart God's plan for his life, and that ultimately will account in biting him in the back. Today we're going to be discussing the topic of relationships, and specifically that of those in a Hebrew context as exemplified by a man by the name of King Solomon. But I would consider the term king to be considered loosely because the book, the Song of Solomon, is a book of the Bible in which relationships are overviewed from us in a way that is really going to get God's stamp of approval. Now note, for those of you listening who would consider yourselves younger, it is a little bit higher than PG-13 in a book, since it discovers all facets and aspects of what a marriage would entail. But for today's study, and especially in regarding today's anime, we're going to be discussing the first two chapters and how the topic of biblical courtship is presented. Now, before we get into terms and definitions, I want to read to you the first verse that will essentially overview this anime in its entirety and what it was representing, it with Prince Zen and our little heartthrob Shirayuki as well. This is the book, The Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 4 through 7. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Sustain me with cakes of raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am lovesick. And all the shippers said, Amen. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand embraces me. I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or the does of the field, do not stir up, nor awaken love until it pleases. Now, the basis of this anime reflects very well with this concept and idea of biblical courtship, and understanding that the time of attraction and dating are going to have their place in preceding betrothal and marriage. Now, for those of you who've seen the anime, you'd know that the series does not end with Zen and Shirayuki getting married, although that was something that we were all dying to see. It is a wonderful romance story and a very interesting take on the medieval aspect. But I want to point out to you the individuals, Shirayuki and Prince Zen, as actual parallels and illustrations to how the Shulamite, Solomon's first and true bride, and King Solomon himself, were presented through these two individuals. And not only considering the fact that we know historically, just like Prince Zen, Prince Solomon, before David's death and becoming the king of Israel, was not the firstborn son of David. He was not first prince of Israel. He was the child, actually, of a pretty shady union between, well, not the child, you had him with Bathsheba afterwards, after that child died, but you understand the point. Bathsheba was his mother. That tells you enough. But when Solomon was named king, it wasn't on account of his lineage, it was on account of his character. And just like we see with Prince Zen, not only was he chronologically born out of time, but the reason why he was chosen as king of Israel in the book of 1 Kings was because God's promises were over his life, and through that he inherited the throne over his brothers of lesser character, even though they were of greater age. He was the wisest king the world has ever known, short of Jesus himself, and was the man who wrote the book of Proverbs, more or less considering a few chapters, which is interesting because at the end of every single one of these episodes in this anime, they quote a passage from Proverbs as it would directly apply to the situation and peril and theme in which they included with their hijinks, and just, well, not just enjoying, but also enduring and surviving the life that was to be included in royalty, as well as everyday human life as well. Now, going on from Prince Zen, we also see that Shirayuki was a good representation of Solomon's first wife, his only true bride. And the fact that just like geographically with Shirayuki, Shunem, the place where Shulamites would come from, was the place of this girl's birth was very far out of the way from this royal city of Jerusalem. And yet, just like Solomon, what we know about him historically was he was not only very wise and well renowned for his writings in wise sayings, but he was also a hobbyist regarding his skills with botany and with, well, all sorts of things. I could go through the list of everything that Solomon accomplished during his time. He was a very successful guy, but he enjoyed his vineyards, and the region of Shunem is in the I'm trying a compass in my head, the southeastern section of the Sea of Galilee, and that would be a heavy spot for where a lot of vineyards would be grown. And in verse 1 of chapter 1, verse 2 of the Song of Solomon, we actually see that the Shulamite's first impressions when she first laid eyes on Solomon was, "Let me kiss him with the kisses of my mouth." So just like with Shirayuki, when she first saw the prince, she was there was for no uncertain terms what that relationship was going to ultimately produce. We were all just writing our fanfics in the very first moment we laid eyes on him, right? But with this also in mind, we see that just like with Shirayuki, when Solomon first laid eyes on her, like we read in the introductory verse here, notice he didn't make her a concubine like said first sleazy prince we recall in episode 1. What did he do? He invited her into his home. And based off of his support of her, allowed her to become more and more a part of his life in chapters 1 and 2, even though at this point they were only friends. And in the end, they eventually dated, and then in chapter 3, the engagement, chapter 4, the wedding day and night, and going on forward to the marriage. And we're going to discuss how biblical betrothal and marriage actually worked, but understand, why didn't Solomon just, pull the prince card and say, well, you are now my wife. I'll take care of you, you'll be well fed, just pull the same junk that brown-haired prince was trying to pull with her. And obviously she wasn't going for that, as no one would. But isn't it interesting? You think like, well, old days, that's how it always worked. But not here with Solomon. He invited her into his home. He supported her. He allowed her to live. She even allowed her to go back home. And he visited her when he had opportunity. Their lives continued as normal. But regarding this relationship, understand that not unlike the geographical and the emotional and the chronological presentation of how Solomon and the Shulamites' relationship progressed, but what was the whole title of this anime? What made Shirayuki such an interesting individual? It was her rare red hair. And how interesting is it that of the 3 main compliments of her beauty that Solomon gave to her on their wedding night, the first of which, in fact, I'll just read the first 3 right here. This is Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 1. He says, "Behold, you are fair, my love. Behold, you are fair. You have dove's eyes behind your veil. Your hair is like a flock of goats going down from Mount Gilead." And then he goes on to continue. Now, you're probably wondering, if a guy said, "I have goat hair," I wouldn't take that as a compliment. But no, where are these goats? What are these goats doing? Well, the black fleeced, furred goats, in which they would be coming down Mount Gilead to the pools of water and springs in which it would be like long flowing black streaks that you would watch at a distance. Solomon was a fan of watching and observing animal behavior as well. So when he was complimenting her, it was really sweet. And noting the dove's eyes, not seeing he's got beady little bird eyes, what he was saying was, knowing that doves they have no peripheral vision, they can only focus on one thing at a time. He's saying, your eyes are beautiful. They're just for me. You can only focus on what you're looking at, and they're looking at me right now. And he goes on to describe details to which he was blushing, which I would be too when I was reading that chapter. But all these things being pointed out, you catch the parallels. He wasn't afraid, just like Prince Zen, when the first moment he saw her, episode 1. They weren't even really considered friends yet. I appreciate you not letting me be handed off to this guy, but he didn't hesitate to compliment her on the one thing that made her unique and special, the thing that which he found beautiful about her. Now note, there were others who disagreed, but frankly Zen didn't care, and neither did Solomon. And that's the cute part about all of this. But continuing, we also need to note that at the end of the series, once again, they didn't get married, but were merely a dating couple. And I think this is no accident, because the interesting thing was, of all the things we discussed about Solomon's character, it stops at chapter 2. And regarding their relationship and how it was intended to progress in Hebrew culture, even if you were royalty, there was a standard by which not only relationships were to be held, but also kings. Because understand, yes, pagan kings would just go around and slaughter people and then take all of their women and add them to his harem as essentially an organic porn closet. And say, well, you guys are just there, and then if I get frisky, I'll let you know. But with all these things being included, understand the kings of Israel were held to a different standard, that the very foundation and concept of women having rights actually began in this book here. Because in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, yes, this is Old Testament God, verses 14 through 20, God actually lays down the standard, not only for individuals and how they're supposed to approach their relationship with God, and by extension other people, which is the foundation of the Ten Commandments, by the way. He also says how kings are to conduct themselves when they start to come on the scene. Because note, the first king was King Saul, and that was at the end of the time of the judges, and at this point, at the writing of Deuteronomy, they weren't even in the nation of Israel yet, let alone having gone through 7 cycles of hell. So, noting that a good amount of time would be passing, and God's already saying now when you have a king. I'll read it. Chapter 17, verses 14 through 20. When you come into the land which the Lord your God is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. Note, Solomon wasn't the firstborn, neither was Prince Zen, but he said, you are going to be chosen not off your chronology of birth, but the content of your character. Someone who will properly represent me to my people. And we discussed this in brevity when we were going through the Bible in the book of Deuteronomy. And I encourage you to listen to that on your own time. He says, from among your own brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Now, obviously, the reason for this would be if you're going to represent God, you want to be from the nation that actually knew who God was. There are plenty of other illustrations and examples in which we see of people knowing God outside the nation of Israel, but God's making a point here. Now, he says this, you shall not multiply horses for himself, nor shall cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses, for the Lord your God said to you, you shall not return that way again. What he's speaking of is military gain. If you start to build up a bigger arsenal, people want to try themselves against it, and God says, no. Have a sizable force for defense of your country, but saying don't multiply for yourselves that. If you want to show off your bucklers and your military, fine, but I'm supposed to be your defense. You don't need all of that. So don't multiply horses. He also said, neither shall he multiply wives for himself. Polygamy was forbidden. And why? Lest his heart turn away. Nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Also it shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write a copy of the book of this law in a book, from one before the priest, the Levites. So the first 5 books of the Bible, he'd write down his own copy, including these verses, so that he'd remember them and know how to rule God's people properly. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. Ready? That he may learn to fear the Lord his God, and be careful to observe all the works of this law, all the words of this law, and these statutes, that his heart, listen, may not be lifted among his brethren, or above his brethren, that he might not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. So the conditions for a king in Israel: don't excess in military because it makes enemies. Don't excess in money because it becomes a distraction from what matters. But lastly, most of all, don't practice polygamy because why? it will lead your heart away from God. One man, one woman, one life. Accordingly, one marriage. And if you misrepresent that, then the whole message is misrepresentative of what God gave marriage to be a picture of in the first place. We'll talk about that again in a minute. And note as well, for those of you who know the end of Solomon's life, yes, he did multiply horses and stables. Yes, he did multiply for himself wives. He ended his life with over 1,000 wives. In fact, 700 wives, 300 concubines, and that's so much better. But you see the point. Now, the reason why Solomon acquired so many wives initially was with reason, as much that could be taken with the historical context. It was because when Solomon was alive during his reign, Israel didn't see any war. And that was because when Solomon would make alliances, it was a custom of pagan kings that when you made an alliance, you would give them their daughter. Or the king would give you one of his daughters, and then you would essentially be considered family. The alliance would be made permanent by the fact that this wife would be now in your home. Now, note, Solomon initially did this ceremoniously, but in time it said that they drew Solomon's heart away from God and started to not only bring in their bodices to distract Solomon from his one true wife, but also they started bringing in their gods to distract him from his relationship with the true and living God, the one who gave him his wisdom in the first place. Now, it's not hard to see why God would ask them to write down all that God had commanded them. This would naturally be an expectation for you to represent the law by knowing it, upholding it, and not deviating from it yourself. But all these things then being pointed out, you understand. You see it paralleled. What was the difference between Prince Zen's character and his older brothers? Well, to his older brother, what was the thing that mattered most? It was money, it was military power, alliances. And this ultimately made him into kind of a jerk. But on the other hand, what was Prince Zen in comparison to him? He was a person that though he was a ruler, it didn't go to his head. He sincerely cared about the lives of those who served him and treated them like friends, not as employees, not as slaves. And that's the point that God's making here. Now, going back to relationships, why didn't Zen just pull the prince card here? Why didn't he force her to marry him? Well, understand that just like Solomon could have done with the Shulamite, love does not exist unless it offers the opportunity to say no. It's the same reason why God offers you the chance to join him in heaven forever. It's a love relationship, not a contract. He could have forced salvation on all of us. He could have just judged sin on some ethereal, eternal force or gone against his purity and just said, no, I'm not even going to create mankind with the capacity to sin. I'm going to create a legion of robots that will, at the push of a button, say, I love you, Lord. That's not the point. God doesn't snatch somebody and say, you're now in my kingdom and you're going to like it. And then when our brains are back in our skulls, we'll say, okay, I love you, Lord. No, he says what? I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Choose life that you may live. He said, to all who come and receive, let him drink from the water of life freely. That's the point that's being made here. And again, paraphrasing, but you understand the point. God offers the option. He offers the relationship. And understand that with this relationship, in the historical context of the nation of Israel, they actually had a very interesting way of organizing a dating relationship. Because when Solomon set out this poem, he actually overviews his first real and probably only true love relationship with the Shulamite woman. And just like we see with Zen and Shirayuki, what was the order of said relationship? How did Hebrew relationships work? Well, the first was attraction. That's obvious enough to know how that's formatted. We saw that in episode 1. And I'm sure all of us know that at one time or another. But the second that followed was the dating period. And dating was not necessarily how we would view it today, although that's sometimes a part of it, going out on errands and spending time together to get to know one another, but essentially it would be to live life as friends. And understand, the friend zone is not a bad thing, according to God's book, so do not grieve, my brothers and sisters. He will bring the one into your life, even if that's not the way that they view you in time. It's the same thing for Shirayuki and Zen. There was a time when that just wasn't the mindset. They sincerely cared about her. They consistently did so, but until it was time, they did not awaken love until it would fully please. What followed this dating relationship and what will proceed, or what will follow immediately after the events that we've seen in this anime was in the engagement period, where they would commit themselves to one another by asking the other to join their family in marriage. That was, of course, the popping the question, the offering of the ring, will you marry me? That was the engagement. What followed the engagement was the betrothal, where the couple would be considered legally married for all intents and purposes. An example of this would be where Mary and Joseph were at during the time in which Mary became pregnant by the Holy Spirit with Jesus, and only by the revelation of an angel to Joseph did he buy the story. Otherwise, you would have to be legally divorced to cut that off. It was a time where they would be separated, in fact, and be given the opportunity, and pay attention to this because this is important, they would be separate for a time to prepare for the wedding and marriage. The husband would go to construct the honeymoon suite and the home that they would be living in with their children in the years to come. But the bride would spend that time doing something interesting. She would be gathering material for her dress. Now, following that, fifth in this list was the wedding ceremony. It was, in fact, especially for kings, not just one couple-hour-long ceremony, but was a week-long party where the marriage would be consummated, and ultimately both parties would be able to celebrate this union of life. Sixth was the marriage. Following that, their lives would continue, but with them as one flesh, having left father and mother. And then seventh, of course, ending the marriage contract, was the death of one or both members, in which they would be parted. But understand that if this was the outline of Hebrew marriage, this was the basis by which Solomon himself followed regarding the standard that all Hebrew men would be required to do in giving the woman the right to say no, and giving the woman the opportunity to prepare herself for the relationship as much as for the man to understand, am I committing to something that I know will be permanent? And then lastly, saying, till death do us part, and fulfilling that promise to the letter. Where did this series stop? Was it with Shirayuki and Zen, in their deathbeds together holding hands in the little awe, and then they both go to heaven together? No. Was it at their wedding day? Was it their wedding night? I hope not. Was it during their marriage? No, it was before the betrothal. Now, stage 2 is where this series ended, and in fact, chapter 2, if we're going to consider the Song of Solomon as a narrative for overviewing these things. And if this is the moral standards by which we view a relationship, that the time of dating, a time of friendship, fellowship, and understanding I like hanging out with this person, and coming to that kind of conclusion for sure before saying I want to commit my life, body, heart, soul, future, and children to this person. What did that include morally? Well, firstly and foremostly, what would undoubtedly be on anyone's mind during that time was, where was the sexual desire to be practiced? Well, in Song of Solomon, chapters 1 and 2, it was indeed present. You don't have to read far to understand that. Not only was the kisses of my mouth part in the first verse following the title, but in chapter 3, verses 1 through 5, it actually notes that the gal was kind of eager to get it on with the guy. And by the way, that does exist. Girls do have a sex drive too, by the way, in case you didn't know. But how did she cope with it? She said, not no, just not now. Sexual desire is going to be present, but it was not acted upon on Solomon or the Shulamite's parts, because even though it is present, it's like getting hungry an hour before dinner. You just understand, I'm not going to die if I wait. Even though it may make some noise, even though it may demand my attention at times, it will be fulfilled. I just need to trust that when that time comes, it will be all that much more sweet. Continuing, how did the interaction time follow itself out? And he said, well, they spent time together as much as possible. They enjoyed spending time together. There's a little note about him playing hide and seek with her. That's a real cute scene, but understand their lives continued as normal. It did not interfere with their responsibilities, and just like we saw in the anime presented and in Song of Solomon, a relationship does add an addition to your life, but it shouldn't supersede everything else that comes in your life until it's been made by God into that level of a priority. And lastly, of course, the focus of their relationship from chapters 1 and 2 was for them to be friends, to get to know each other, to learn as much about each other as possible. And even though it would progress further in time, to which we have textual evidence of being the case, it wasn't a bad thing. It's like Shirayuki had the hots for Zen. There were other people in her life that were of influence too, and it wasn't something he had to be jealous of. There were plenty of people who was just like, well, forget Shirayuki. What if Zen wasn't the one? What if there's some other individual that grabs her attention? And to them, I just say you need to double check with the writers, because they intended that relationship to occur from the beginning. And I say the same for real life too. Now, you'd probably ask a question again. Didn't Solomon end up marrying 1,000 women like you said at the end of his life? Yes, but understand, for the reason God warned him in Deuteronomy, and something he had written down several times already personally, understand that Solomon was not Jesus. Zen is not perfect. We are human beings. And even though we know at times things are wrong, we still do them. But understand that even though these mistakes aren't followed, even though purity maybe hasn't been a priority in your own relationships listening to this, understand it's never too late to start. Even with Zen, he kissed her, and it was apologized for because it wasn't the time yet, even though it was greatly appreciated on both parties. So do you understand the part? Understand the point that's being made here? Now, we've discussed the historical, we've discussed the practical, and in a way the personal. But how do we understand the spiritual? What's the extension of this and how it applies to our relationship with Jesus? Well, understand, the way that Hebrew marriage was laid down by Solomon, and the reason why this book, which is for all intents and purposes could be considered sexually explicit to a legalistic audience, is included in the Bible because it overviews a relationship of a marriage done God's way. And the interesting thing is that if we first understand that marriage is a picture of something greater, no, we aren't going to one day be married to Jesus and then have sex with him and have children. No, that's not the point. We are given a picture of that bodily in this physical realm to give us a hint, an idea of the same opportunity that we will have in heaven by extension and infinitely more. So for me to say, I'm betrothed to Jesus, it's not gay. It's emphasizing a point that just like with Hebrew marriage, our relationship with God will one day be fulfilled in the same way. Secondly, if we also understand that the time we have here on earth is our quote-unquote betrothal time, stage 3, or stage 4 rather, in our relationship with Jesus, the engagement is the choice in which we chose salvation with him, then we need to follow every single point made, because what's the definition of a betrothal? Well, it's a time where you're for all intents and purposes legally married, but separate for a time as the husband prepares your home and as the bride prepares her dress for the special day. Now, do we see examples of this in Scripture? Does Jesus emphasize that as he departs, he's going to symbolically prepare a home for us? Absolutely. John chapter 14, verses 2 through 3. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. The role of the husband, anyone? He's preparing our hearts to enjoy him in heaven forever. Now you're saying, well, aren't mansions literal things? Is he speaking symbolically? How do you know? Well, understand the language that he uses here. In my Father's house are many mansions. What, does he have like mega duplexes inside a giant larger house? No, he's making the point. What's a house? It's a dwelling place for living beings. And if our living being, this house, this tent as Paul refers it to in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, will one day be put off, that we may have a building, a permanent housing place, that unlike this tent, this baggage of canvas and bones and skin and leather and tarp, we will be replaced by a body that will never perish, that's intended to be permanent. And not just that, but an even greater body than we could ever imagine. And I'm not just referring to size. I'm not even referring to that, in fact. I'm referring to capabilities. Because we saw what a resurrected body looked like in Jesus. He could enter rooms without using the door. He could eat food and enjoy it. He could touch and interact with people. And he could fly. So just noting that part. But you see the point. So if that's the husband's role, how do we fill the role of the wife if we're betrothed to him? Well, as he is separated physically from us for a time, but we are still considered married, how did this all play out? Well, do we join in this process like the bride in preparing her dress? Yes, in fact we do. Revelation 19, verse 7. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright. The same illustration, by the way, in Zechariah that was used to be describing the salvation of the Lord, in taking off the robes of our lives, covered in filth, and replacing it with his rich robe of righteousness, a right relationship with him. Clean and bright, for the fine linen is what? The righteous acts of the saints. What was the role of the bride again? To gather materials for her dress. What is our purpose here in this life? To live lives according to godliness. That as sojourners and pilgrims we would live separate from the things of this world, but among them as an example. You see the point. So with all these things being pointed out, like we saw with Zen and Shirayuki, like we see with Solomon and the Shulamite, and like we see with us ultimately, and Jesus, we will one day be able to wear this dress in heaven. Not as a physical garb, it's a symbol, but the point remains. If you know Jesus as Lord, he knows you as his betrothed bride. And separate from his royal family, for now, understand that for whatever reason he had in going out of his way to take us from this disaster of a nation we call this world and making us a part of his kingdom, though we aren't received as its citizens yet, physically. With everything that he's done to save us from separation from him forever, you are now welcome in his home, and one day will be, not just as a citizen, but as his bride, the guest of honor, the welcomed audience. And understand that when that day comes, we'll not only be welcomed by the celebration of angels, but the only reason that that would ever happen at all is because of his love for you. Time and time again, the Shulamite said, "Why do you find me beautiful?" And to my fellow brothers out there who are married and your wives continue to ask you, "Do you love me?" It's as much a level of insecurity as much as a comforting reminder. It's not that they've forgotten. They just want to know that level of security, that you have another way of reminding them. And with all these things being pointed out as the truth, what was the only reason Zen had in wanting to make Shirayuki a part of his life at all, if not going way out of his way to keep her safe? It's because he loved her. Though it wasn't time to act on it yet, it was still present. The same thing is also true. If we're betrothed to Jesus, why don't we see him? Because he's preparing your heart for heaven. And when it is prepared, he will come to take you home. Not a second sooner and not a moment late. But why did he choose us in the first place? Why did he go out of his way to make himself not only a sacrifice for our sins, but even more so and more importantly, to make us a treasure in his kingdom? Because he loves you. There's no other way to explain it than that, and there is no other need to explain further. Thank you for your time and listening to this study. I hope it's been a blessing to you. If you have any questions, like to know more about the topics discussed in this anime, about the life of Solomon, Hebrew betrothal, the Shulamite, Deuteronomy, anything, leave them in the comments below. Sincerity will always be matched with clarity. If you want to encourage the ministry, you know where to go, but most importantly, if you know someone who's seen this anime or heard of these themes, but perhaps hasn't seen them applied before, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it or needs to hear it. Thank you for your time to listen to this study. And again, I'll take the time to remind you that Jesus loves you, and I'll continue to do so until he can tell you himself.